This block of marble is the key to understanding what makes a truly great mix. That's heavy. You see, the fate of your mix has already been decided when you start the mixing process. Just the same way that if I was a sculptor, the statue that I'm going to make out of this block of marble is constrained by the block itself. I can't create a really big statue out of this, and I can't create a statue that doesn't match the dimensions of this block. Yet all the time, people take a set of recordings or tracks that they have, and when they get to the mixing and mastering process, they try to make it into something it's not, and they end up with a garbled mess. They try to get their track to sound exactly the same way as their references when their reference tracks are different songs made in a different place in a different time, and the sonic building materials are in no way the same. And that's what I want to focus on in this lesson. So if you're struggling to achieve the sound you have in your head and you feel completely deflated when you compare your mix to other mixes out there, then watch until the very end, because I'm going to give you a complete roadmap for bridging the gap between your track and your reference tracks. There are 3 core areas that we're going to focus on today. 1, the best way to use references from a technical standpoint. 2, beginner versus expert referencing. And 3, mixing versus mastering referencing. Okay, let's dive in. This video is about the dualism of referencing and the 2 opposing forces of using reference material and also being original at the same time. 2 polar opposites, a dichotomy that we have to constantly manage as creatives. On one hand, you have sayings like still like an artist or imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. But when it comes to mixing, if you try and replicate your references exactly, then you're missing out on the whole point of the mixing process in the first place. What is the point, you might ask? It's music, it's emotion, it's creativity. None of those things can be attained by copying what somebody else did. Don't get me wrong, referencing is extremely important, but to take your mixes from good to great and become both a better engineer and a better musician, you need to treat each track like the unique work of art that it is. Okay, enough philosophizing, let's get practical here. When it comes to sourcing your reference tracks, you have 2 options. Option 1 is you can use hdtracks.com to download lossless files, or you can use Amazon to download high quality MP3s. I prefer using lossless files, then I load those files into a plugin called Reference for mastering the mix, which makes it easy to volume match and compare frequency spectrums. Then there's option 2, which avoids the need to download music, but it's a little bit more complex. And that's using Tidal to stream high resolution, often master quality music, then using an internal audio routing Mac like Loopback on Mac or Source Nexus on Windows to route that audio back into your DAW. And this approach is more technically complicated and you might have trouble setting it up, but if you're computer savvy, it's worth a try. And I included a step-by-step breakdown in the description of how to set that up if you're interested. Which option you choose is up to you, but I personally use a mixture of these 2 approaches. I have my go-to references downloaded from HD Tracks and I load them up into the reference plugin. Then I also use Tidal when I want to use references that I wouldn't normally use. Whatever approach you take, just make sure you use modern reference tracks from the last decade or so. Anything older than that is going to be lacking in certain areas because production technology has moved on so much in recent years. Okay, so that's how you get references into your DAW, but what next? Let's move on now to beginner versus expert referencing. As you become more skilled at music production, the way you use references changes. And you want to think of this like a journey over time with a gradual shift from heavy use of references when you're starting out to light use of references as you become more adept. As a beginner, I actually found it extremely helpful to intentionally copy reference tracks and a great exercise to try and replicate the sound that somebody else achieved and reverse engineer how they got there. I can think of one mix in particular where I did this. I was feeling really lost at the time. I wasn't sure what I needed to do next in order to improve my mixes. And I was feeling totally overwhelmed with all of the different advice out there. And I thought, screw it. I'm just going to reference a ton. And I mean, every minute or so, I'm going to listen to each individual instrument and see how it sounds and see if I can replicate it. And to my surprise, that mix came out really well. And at the time, it was probably my best mix to date. Looking back now, it makes a ton of sense why that was, as it forced me to listen really critically to a mix and try and figure out what was going on and then try and replicate that. So it was a combination of critical listening, then leveraging the tools at my disposal to achieve a specific outcome. Little did I know, I'd stumbled across 2 key principles in the production process. The first, which is critical listening, and that's really everything. And the more you train your hearing abilities over time, the easier mixing and mastering will become. And I highly recommend you use a service like Sound Gym to train your ears on a daily basis. And the other key principle was having a specific outcome I wanted before I reached for a tool. I stopped grabbing for an EQ for the sake of it and just sweeping around to see what sounded good. And instead I went through the thinking process of, okay, this kick sounds really dull in comparison. It's not cutting through the mix. What can I do to help with that? Well, I probably need to boost it up a mid-range because that's what I'm hearing in the reference track. And it sounds like it's somewhere around 1 kilohertz and 5 kilohertz. So I'll start there. This combination of critical listening and having a desired outcome is the primary loop that you're going through again and again when you're mixing and mastering. It's the audio engineering version of the scientific method. You observe what's going on, you form a hypothesis about what needs to change, you take action on that hypothesis, and then you start the loop all over again, observing whether or not that change achieved the outcome you wanted and taking the next action. Now, as you become more of an expert, the mix or master that you're observing in that first step is your own mix or master, not a reference track. But when you're starting out, you don't have as much of an internal compass to guide you. So instead, you use an external compass, which is your references. That's where you start. You observe the difference between your track and your references and form a hypothesis about what needs to change. So in summary, as a beginner, I actually recommend you use reference tracks aggressively. I personally recommend that you pick 2 or 3 tracks that are similar in terms of genre, instrumentation, and general vibe, and check them frequently. Let me jump into my DAW now and show you this in action. Okay, so I've got a track here. It's a song called Leaf. And for demonstration purposes, I've taken this from the Cambridge multi-track library. So let's have a quick listen. I've done a rough volume balance, and it's at the point where in the mix, if I was a beginner, I'd be thinking a lot more about, okay, let me find something that I can kind of replicate and model here. Okay, so we need some kind of modern rock alternative, potentially with female vocals specifically. So we're going to try and get as close as we can. Now, nothing actually comes to mind. Maybe some of the more recent Florence and the Machine. So this is kind of modern. Some of it will definitely fall into that rock category. It's definitely poppy, kind of pop rock with a female vocal. But we need some distorted guitars in there, really. Long sustained guitars. So this is definitely one that we could use. Let's add these to a new playlist. But let's keep looking. And we can even Google it. Modern alt rock female vocal. Let's see what comes up. Normally you can find a good Reddit thread. So I don't recognize a lot of these. Yes, that's more recent. Something like Courtney Love is probably going to be a bit too dated. Not recent enough, but let's try some yes. That's a cool track. Let's use that one. Okay, and maybe we can find one more. Wolf Alice, I'm sure I've heard them before. Let's give that a go. So this all sounds great. It's a little bit more synth based. So again, I'm looking for something that's got those kind of like sustained distorted guitars. That works. So let's add this to the playlist as well. Okay, so we could keep going, but just to show you an example there, we've got a few. So for now, I'm just going to route these back into my DAW. Like I said, there's a step-by-step breakdown in the description of how to do this, but I'm going to set my input to loop back. Then I'm going to set the output of my computer to loop back. Set this to record arm. And when we hit play here, sometimes I feel like throw my hands up in the air. We've got that coming in there. And now if we want, we can add some metering to our output so we can actually volume match these. And you can use anything for this. One plugin I really like is the Klanghelm VU meter. This is like $10 or something. You can set this to RMS and then just compare. So about 23.8. Cool, so that's close enough. The thing is, because this is unmixed, the levels are all over the place. So the RMS reading is very different to a fully produced track that's a lot more consistent dynamically. So you're never going to get it perfectly. You could try using a LUFS meter if you wanted to as well, but you just want to get it in that kind of ballpark as close as you can, but don't obsess over it. And now that we've done that, the other tracks should be similar. Some of them might be louder, some of them might not, but they should be in that kind of ballpark now. So what we can do is we can start to compare our mix to these reference mixes and start to get an idea of what are the big, bold things that we need to start with. What are the main major problems in the mix that we can tackle first? So in terms of the overall sonic footprint, the first thing that's just really jumping out to me is we've had this kind of sterile upper mid-range in this mix, where it just needs a lot of taming. It's sounding a little bit harsh. It doesn't have that like same depth in the low end and that kind of bright top end. And also the really big difference is space. In the reference mix, we've got a lot of kind of reverb, and it's just got this nice front to back depth. Whereas our mix sounds very dry and kind of thin, and there's no depth to it. Everything just sounds very direct. So let's keep going. The other thing that's jumping out at me is just the drums in general. The snare doesn't sound great. This is an annoying one where the drums have actually been printed to a stereo track. But I'm thinking with some kind of clever processing, I could probably get some kick and snare samples into that and trigger it. If I use an EQ and stuff like that to just isolate the snare and then use that as a trigger, I could probably get snare and kick samples and layer them on top of that. So yeah, that kind of stuff. Let's try the last reference. All the same stuff. So it's at this point, it's pretty clear at a kind of holistic level what needs to happen, just in terms of, okay, focusing a lot on that upper mid-range, on that dryness, taming some of that kind of harshness and sterile aspect of this, and then adding reverb, that kind of stuff. So I just need to go through the process here. I mean, this is only a rough volume balance. I need to go through, I need to fix these drums. I need to continue to get the volume balance right. I need to add compression and automation and clipping and limiting to everything to kind of lock it into place and create that kind of consistency. So it's like one consistent block instead of just kind of poking all over the place. So at this point, I just need to start the process. Now, further on, what you could do is you could listen to specific things, and we're going to come back to this in a second. We're going to talk about mixing versus mastering referencing. And remember, the goal is to check frequently. So as you're going through each instrument or each channel, focus on that specific aspect in the mix as well. So let's start with the snare here as an example. And we're going to unpack this a lot more in the next section when we talk about mixing versus mastering referencing. But I want to give you a quick example here. Let's focus on the snare. First of all, ask yourself, how loud is it? How loud is the snare in the mix? Do we need to bring it down? Do we need to bring it up? Just focus on the volume balance. That's normally the main thing that you want to be focusing on. And then after that, we can start to focus on the tone as well. How does it sound? Is it got as much crack or body? And also dynamically, is it locked into place? Has it got the same kind of attack and aggression, or do we need to address that as well? So it's probably quite a bit too high in the mix. So let's try pulling down the drums overall and see if that helps. But what we might find is, because it's all in one stereo track, is we're bringing down the whole drum kit, and then the snare is lower, but maybe the kick's lower, and maybe we don't want that. But let's give it a go. Yeah, so now the issue is the kick's too quiet and the cymbals are too quiet. Focus on the cymbals specifically, and you'll hear that there's a big volume discrepancy. And we do have a cymbals channel, but the hi-hat is in this loop. So listen to the level of the hi-hat and the cymbals. So we're going to have to do something a bit smarter with this, where I'm going to try and turn this into a snare sample. And that's a technique for a different video. But it gives you an idea here of, okay, we're constantly checking, we're focusing on specific aspects. Each channel, as we go through it, we can compare, how does this sound in my mix compared to how does this sound in the reference tracks? And it just guides you through the entire process. Okay, so you start out that way, but how does this process change as you get more experienced? Well, expert level referencing is almost the total opposite of what I just told you in every single way. Instead of checking references constantly throughout the mixing process, you might listen to a few tracks at the very start and at the very end of the session. And that's about it. When you first sit down, you're just looking to tune your ears to your room and your speakers, like a quick calibration before you dive in. And you can even listen to a wide range of genres instead of just the genre of the track that you're working on. Then at the end of the session, you're using references as one final check to make sure you haven't gone way off base. Outside of that, if you go and have a long break, you might want to listen to a few tracks to recalibrate your ears, or if you've switched to a different set of monitors or headphones, you might want to recalibrate again. But otherwise, you're focusing a lot more on doing what the music is telling you it needs, rather than trying to replicate somebody else's music. Going back to the marble analogy, while it can be helpful at first to try and replicate somebody else's sculpture while you're learning to use the tools and learning what a good sculpture actually is, once you've passed that phase, it can actually be detrimental to try and copy somebody else's sculpture. Instead, you want to uncover the best possible sculpture that's within the block of material that you already have. And that's going to be totally different every single time, depending on your starting material. And while you might still be using references to some extent as an external compass to make sure you don't go way off base, for the majority of the process, you're using your internal compass. And that internal compass constitutes two different areas. One is your feelings and your emotions, and guiding the music to where it needs to be to have an emotional impact on the listener. Remember, this is the primary goal, to enhance and uncover the emotion that's already inside the song. But there's a second aspect to your internal compass, and that's the more technical audio production side, which is your own tastes, preferences, and ideas of what sounds good and what sounds bad. Then you listen to your mix or you listen to your master and you identify problems in the production. You start to pick up on things that grab your attention and don't quite sound right. Then you go through that scientific method where you observe, form a hypothesis, act, and then reorient to identify the next problem or enhancement. This skill will simply come with time. The more music you listen to and the more mixes and masters you do, the more you develop your own personal taste when it comes to production style. There's no way to shortcut this. You just need to do hundreds of mixes and masters. So that's the difference between beginner and expert level referencing, and you could be somewhere in the middle, and that's okay. In fact, that's where you'll spend the majority of your time, somewhere in the transition between these two modes of referencing. Just make sure you don't get stuck in this place of copying references, as it will start to hold you back at a certain point. And if you want help knowing exactly where you are on this journey and you want somebody to listen to your music and tell you where you're at, well, that's one of the first things we do when somebody joins our year-long program. And you can go to mastering.com to learn more about how all of that works. Now, before we go into mixing versus mastering, what exactly are you meant to focus on when you're listening to reference tracks? Well, there are 5 specific areas that you need to observe if you want to bridge the gap between your mixes and the mixes you're referencing. And to help you do this properly when you're mixing or mastering, I put together a reference sheet, and it's a PDF that walks you through these 5 areas, and you can pull this up and walk through the exact process every single time you're working on a project. And you can access this PDF by clicking the link in the description below. Just enter your email on that page and I'll send you the PDF along with a detailed video walking you through that sheet and showing you how to implement it and analyze these 5 specific areas. So if you want to go do that, just pause this video now and go and grab the PDF. Okay, moving on now to mixing versus mastering referencing. First, I want to distinguish between local versus global listening. Local listening is when you focus on one specific aspect of the mix, like the volume of the kick or the tone or the dynamics of the vocal. And this is the primary mode of listening during the mixing phase. You're still listening to the mix as a whole and optimizing for the sound of the entire mix, but the way you do that is by making smaller local changes. Then global listening is when you listen to the mix as a whole and the overall sonic footprint. And this is of course associated a lot more with the mastering phase. So how does all of this relate to referencing? Well, when you're using references while you're mixing, focus on the local aspects more than the global. Hone in on how loud each part is, how each part sits in the mix in terms of frequency, space, and dynamics. Then when you're mastering, listen to the track as a whole and focus on the external relationships to all the other music out there. How does the overall frequency balance compare to your references? How does the volume compare? How do the dynamics compare? So with all that being said, there are additional ways in which mixing and mastering are different as it relates to referencing, but I think that's enough for one day. Of course, a common question that comes up when talking about referencing in the mastering phase is whether or not automated mastering tools could beat a human by referencing thousands of tracks instead of just a few. And with that in mind, I highly recommend you watch our first ever podcast episode starring Devon Terrell, as one of the core themes was subjectivity and creativity in music and how AI will never be able to replace humans in this sense. It's a great conversation, and he touched on a lot of other stuff too, like how to grow as an independent artist in 2023. You should see it on screen now, so just click that to start watching. Okay, that's all for this lesson. I hope you found it useful. Don't forget to go away and actually implement what you learned here in order to get results, and enjoy the podcast.